Check. Esther will take care of the kids. Sunday we're starting a new study, but in reality, we did a recap. In fact, we did an introduction last Sunday, and I'm just going to take on from that. And I'm going to explain to you why we're doing what we're doing. But just a second. Okay. Okay. So those who are on the Zoom don't have the presentation, but okay, those on Zoom, the presentation is on the Zoom. Okay, we're not sharing on Zoom, correct? No, the PDF is there. What do you say? It is in the chat box. Okay. So the way we're going to start today is this. I'm going to request us to do something different. If we can get up and interact with a couple of people before we start this Sunday, because there seems to be a very solemn atmosphere, which is a good thing. We need solemnness in our hearts, okay? But we also need a little bit of interaction. And so in order for us to prepare, because we're going to be studying the book of Judges for the next 6 weeks. Okay, it's a book that we're not normally reading in our devotional life. Okay, so let's just get up and meet people and discuss this one question. Yeah, how could some troubles in your life and our lives become opportunities for you to grow spiritually? It's just a question that you can ask. If you can get up, meet somebody and ask this question and discuss and share your opinions. How could troubles in life become opportunities for spiritual growth? Is that okay if we can just get up and move around and meet people? Check. Just give another 1 more minute. We can actually get back to our seats if you're done. And if it's possible, you can take a seat that's right in the front. Come. Those on Zoom, I hope you're okay. Guys, come, let's gather back. Let's gather back. I don't know if you'll come, let's gather back and take our seats. I don't know if you remember last week I started off by saying I haven't preached for 2 months, so I need to make up all the time. It could be another long sermon. But Yeah, so I hope you had some kind of conversation. Last week, what we really did is, in last week's, I'm just going to recap. We saw that the author of Judges shows us how Israel fails to drive out the idols of the land. They fail to break down the altars of the Canaanites, and it creates a dramatic tension between God's, the love on one side and the holiness on the other side. You remember that? Yeah. The other thing that so God was demanding obedience. At the same time, He's also promising to save them. And there was this apparent tension. Now, because of this tension, the people of Israel get into a cyclic pattern. There was a cycle, there was a pattern. And you remember the diagram I showed last Sunday? There was a pattern of revival and decline, revival and decline. We also see that God continues to rebuke them for their sin. At the same time, He is constantly delivering them from their mess. He's on one side, He's rebuking them for their sin and their ungodly ways, but at the same time, He's consistently delivering them from the peril that they're in. God is never casting them off. He is never casting them off, but he continues to graciously work for their growth. And beginning of the third chapter that we're going to be looking in today, we start to see a specific theme of how God delivers his people. And the way he does that is he raises up leaders. And over the next 5 weeks, as we talk of different leaders in the book of Judges, the different judges actually, we're going to be seeing how all of these leaders, the purpose of studying the lives of these leaders and how God picks up these people to deliver Israel at a particular time in their history, actually points to shadows Jesus Christ, who will come many centuries later. And by that time, I'm hoping we will be at the Easter weekend and we'll be able to speak about that in that way. The question that we're going to be answering today is this. We're going to be answering a couple of things. Now, historically, we're going to see how God worked with weak, how God worked with fragile, or very, with modest people to deliver to deliver Israel. Currently, how God continues to work with you and me for the same purpose. But redemptively, we're going to be answering a question today. How do people who are temporary liberators, who are temporary, short-term deliverers, how do those people actually point to Christ, and Christ being the ultimate liberator, Christ being the ultimate deliverer and the ultimate savior? So this sermon today is not really a sermon about Ehud, the judge. Ehud is a part of today's teaching, but essentially it's a sermon on how God's methods, his approach to deliver his children. And in that grand narrative, Ehud has a role to play. So I'd like to ask us, how many have actually heard of this name Ehud in the Bible? How many have read and studied about Ehud in the Bible? Okay, that's really the condition of Christians today. When I posted this post, we're going to speak on Ehud. They thought it was a electronic version of a hoodie, an Ehud. Okay? But it's not a name. It's not a story that we are constantly thinking about as people who read the Bible. And we're going to be doing that today. My friend Merlin will just read the first Bible reading for today. Is that okay? We're going to be looking at Judges chapter 3 verses 7 to 11. Come, Merlin.
And the Israelites did evil in the sight of the Lord, and they forgot what they thought and served the Baals and the Ashur. So the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and sold them into the hand of king of Mesopotamia. And the Israelites served Kushan-Rishathaim. But when the Israelites cried out to the Lord for help, the Lord raised up a man with the people of Israel. the son of Karan, who lives in the Spirit of the Lord came upon him, and he judged Israel. He went out to war, and the Lord gave Untitled, king of Saviour, into his hands, and he became a persecution, and the land was at peace from the vision of the
Thanks, William. So before we look at Ehud, we're going to be looking at these 5 verses. It speaks of Othniel, the judge before Ehud. But that's not the point. The point I'm trying to make is look at verse 7. According to verse 7, why did the Israelites do evil? Why did the Israelites do evil? And the simple answer is they forgot God. It's there in verse 7. So the text does not say they forgot about God. It's not like they had a memory lapse. They knew their history. They knew that God existed. But essentially what was happening is Israel forgot. To say that the Israelites forgot God is to say that they were no longer controlled by what they knew. They were no longer controlled by what they knew of God, of their history, and what God, the kind of life that God wanted them to live. In another way, to put it another way, though they knew who God was, and though they knew what God wanted, those things were not real to them. Jonathan Edwards, a theologian, believes that this is the main problem Christians then and Christians have today. We can know God, we can even know what God expects from us, and yet those things will not be real to us. I mean, think of a father telling a child, can you do this for me? Can you do this task for me? Can you open an account for me? And every day as his child goes to work, the child knows that the father asked. The father wants a bank account. The child knows the father cannot do it on his own, and yet the child would think, why does he need a bank account? He knows what the father needs. He knows what. I mean, that's a very poor example, but the point I'm trying to say is, you can know what the Israelites knew who God was. They knew their history. They knew the kind of life that God wanted them to live, and yet it was not real to them. And what we know with our heads, if it's not real in our hearts, this is the problem, isn't it? We can acknowledge something intellectually, something that's true, but in our hearts, it will not penetrate. In our hearts, what we know will not control us. What it really means is, what the Israelites were going through is, it means that they were in agreement with the truth and yet not affected by the truth. And the New Testament talks about this. For those of us who went through the gospel-centered life, the cohorts that we had, Peter speaks in 2 Peter chapter 1, and he writes about the same problem. He writes about this problem that people forget. The reason, he says, we are unable to be effective in our faith, the reason we are unable to be productive in our faith, is because, he says in 2 Peter 1, 5 verses 8 and 9, we forget that we've been cleansed by sin. Sorry, cleansed from sin by Christ. And this is still the root problem. It was not just the problem in the book of Judges or New Testament. It's still the root problem for us today. We continually lose the sense of the gospel on our hearts. We continually lose a sense of what Christ has done for us. But coming back to the book of Judges, while this is true, and this is what happened in verses 7, we begin to also see a glimpse of what revival looks like. If you look at verses 9, the people only do one thing, but that one thing is absolutely crucial. They cried out to the Lord. And I'm going to tell you why this is worth to term as a revival. Why is it almost like a miracle? What does crying out to the Lord really mean in this context? It implies that the Israelites realized that there is no other God substitute that could help them. Friends, it implies repentance. It explicitly means that they came together to pray as a corporate body, asking God for help. And if you're a logical person, you would realize getting people together in a room corporately asking God for help is nothing short of a miracle these days. Corporate prevailing prayer was the one thing the people did to prepare for revival. And friends, unless we see the deep gravity of how the Israelites realized their need for God, we will never be able to truly appreciate the way of how God provides a leader, an unassuming leader in Ehud that we're going to see as an answer to their prayer. In verse 30, towards the end of the chapter, God sends them Ehud, and in verse 30, we see that because of Ehud, through Ehud, Israel experienced peace in the land for 8 decades. Okay? Now we come to Ehud. The sermon actually starts now. And I'm going to invite somebody, if they could come to read the second Bible reading. Would somebody be willing to come up and volunteer to read the second Bible reading? It's about 19 verses. And it's a very fascinating story of Ehud going and killing a fat man. Okay? Not just a fat man, he was the king. Is anybody willing? Judges chapter 3, 23.
Judges chapter 3, verses 12 onwards. Again, the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord. And because they did this evil, the Lord gave Eglon, king of Moab, power over Israel, getting the Ammonites and Amalekites to join him. Eglon came and attacked Israel, and they took possession of the city of palms. The Israelites were subject to Eglon, king of Moab, for 18 years. Again, the Israelites cried out to the Lord, and he gave them a deliverer, Ehud, a left-handed man, the son of Gera the Benjamite. The Israelites sent him with tributes to Eglon, king of Moab. Now Ehud had made a double-edged sword about a cubit long, which he strapped to his right thigh under his clothing. He presented the tribute to Eglon, king of Moab, who was a very fat man. After Ehud had presented the tribute, he sent on their way those who had carried it. But on reaching the stone images near Gilgal, he himself went back to Eglon and said, "Your Majesty, I have a secret message for you." The king said to his attendants, "Leave us." And they all left. Ehud then approached him while he was sitting alone in the upper room of his palace and said, "I have a message from God for you." As the king rose from his seat, Ehud reached with his left hand, drew the sword from his right thigh, and plunged it into the king's belly. Even the handle sank in after the blade, and his bowels discharged. Ehud did not pull the sword out, and the fat closed in over it. Then Ehud went out to the porch. He shut the doors of the upper room behind him and locked them. After he had gone, the servants came and found the doors of the upper room locked. They said he must be relieving himself in the inner room of the palace. They waited to the point of embarrassment, but when he did not open the doors of the room, they took a key and unlocked them. There they saw their lord fallen to the floor, dead. While they waited, Ehud got away. He passed by the stone images and escaped to Seirah. When he arrived there, he blew a trumpet in the hill country of Ephraim, and the Israelites went down with him from the hills with him leading them. "Follow me," he ordered, "for the Lord has given Moab, your enemy, into your hands." So they followed him down and took possession of the fords of the Jordan that led to Moab. They allowed no one to cross over. At that time, they struck down about 10,000 Moabites, all vigorous and strong. Not one escaped. That day, Moab was made subject to Israel, and the land had peace for 80 years.
Thanks. So you need to understand the context is this King Eglon was overpowering and kind of conquering the Israelites, and the Israelites were not free. They needed to be rescued. They needed deliverance. And God sends Ehud. And in this dramatic, very expressive storyline, we see how Israel, God delivered them. But let's just gather a few facts about Ehud from this passage. Okay, prior to him becoming Israel's judge, so he was a son of Gera. He belonged to the tribe of Benjamin. Benjamin was one of the 12 tribes, for those of us who don't know, from Jacob. And I mean, that is important, but that's another story another time. It's also noted that he was a left-handed man. Now, this is interesting because today we don't make a special highlight and spotlight on those who are lefties. We don't do that. Today we don't do that. In fact, if you read for many years, people who could not use the right, people who were left-handed were considered, they had some kind of deformity. You should just go on Google and read it up. But it's a special mention over here that he was a left-handed man, and because he was a left-handed man, the details of this is important for his mission, which I'm going to be talking about. So we see that he made himself a small sword. He strapped it under his right thigh. If he was a right-handed man, he would have strapped it under his left thigh. Okay. He then visits this king under a pretext of bringing a tribute. But so when he comes into the courts, he's checked. He was checked for weapons, but this small sword apparently, people were expecting the sword to be on the left thigh, but he was a lefty, so it was in the right thigh. So he was able to just pass through. Nobody expected him to be a threat. Following this presentation, he also said, I want to meet the king alone. I've got a secret message for the king. Nobody had any problem because what will a left-handed do? The king, he's not even a strong man. So they allowed him to do that. And then he strikes the king. And the king was obese. The sword disappeared inside his belly. Ehud left the sword, escaped through a porch. Now let's stop. Let me just stop here and remind us that the purpose of the story is not to convey and communicate endorsements for killing kings and people. Okay, the purpose is to see how God answers the prayers of His people by sending them an unassuming leader with unassuming skills to deliver them. So some interesting observations from this reading. To the first readers of this passage, this great surprise would have been that Ehud, the man that God used, Ehud, was a left-handed man. Verse 15. Now, why is this such a great surprise for the first readers of those times? Why is this such a great surprise? Because you need to understand, as you scan the Bible actually expresses a lot of weight on people, not people, but with this aspect of right hand. Okay, in Isaiah, God swears by his right hand. In the Psalms, he has pleasures at his right hand. And still in another Psalm, his chosen one sits at his right hand. Now, since most people were right-handed then and even today, since most people were right-handed then, the right hand was a symbol of power and ability. So this term in chapter 3, verse 15 is a very fascinating, in fact, it's a very thought-provoking phrase that Ehud was a left-handed man. Now, for you and me, as you read the book of Judges, we can just read the book of Judges, verse 15, he was a left, and we'll go on to the next verse. For the original readers, if they read this verse, Ehud was a left-handed man, they would stop and think, aha, here's a man who cannot use his right hand. That's what the first readers would think. Okay, it's pretty possible that his right hand was maybe paralyzed or disabled, but this deformity, or so what people thought is deformity, this handicap is that he cannot use his right hand. What does that mean? What does that mean? It means that none of his enemies would expect Ehud to be a dangerous man. And that is important to understand the text. None of the Moabites, none of the enemies of Israel would think that he is a dangerous man. He is not a threat. No one was expecting skillfulness and proficiency in the left hand. If Ehud could not use a weapon in his right hand, they would conclude, all would assume that he cannot use a weapon at all. And that is why he was even accepted to the court of Moab. And that is why he's even given access to the presence of a king with nobody over there. So not only does he lead the group by bringing a tribute, but afterwards he's also asking for a private audience with Eglon. We need to understand that strong people, warriors, were a threat to the king. They would never be allowed this kind of access that Ehud had. If Ehud was a strong man, using his right hand with these weapons, and he was a soldier, he would not be allowed access to the king. But because of this so-called deformity that they thought, he presents no risk to the Moabites. It's almost like, we have a term in Hindi, he's a kacha limbu. Bring him, what will he do? And as it turned out, the ability of Ehud to use his knife with his left hand was crucial to his ability to surprise the king. But, but we see in these few verses the hand of God. We see the power of God in Ehud's story. How do we see that? The first thing that we read about a lone man walking into the palace of the king, assassinating the king, and walking out without being captured. This was highly unexpected. It's a highly unexpected event. It involved great risk. If it was not Ehud who went there, anybody else would pose a great threat, a great risk. A lone man walking to a king's palace, assassinating the king, and walking out without being caught. That's the first impression of God's power. The second thing, which is in my opinion even more important, is that one battle changed the next 80 years of Israel's history. You see, Ehud's story involves more than just putting a spear or a sword into the belly of a fat king. No, it's much more. It includes not just the removal of a wicked leader in King Eglon, but it also includes a change in the national history for one entire generation. Ehud's story is a story of success. It's a story of freedom. His success is a story of freedom because if you remember their history, just like God redeemed them from Pharaoh, from the land of Egypt and splitting this Red Sea, over here again, God is redeeming Israel from the bondage under a wicked king, Eglon, just when they met as a corporate body and to ask for God's help. This, my friends, is what revival looks like. I want to move the spotlight from the book of Judges and begin to move the spotlight on our lives now. God works with the least expected people. And this is not just because of Ehud. In fact, in the subsequent chapters, we read of people like Deborah. Deborah may have been one of the best judges, but she's a woman. And in those days, which we're going to actually be studying in a few weeks, they had a perspective of women. So when you think of a woman as a deliverer, it was least expected, and God chooses Deborah. Think of Gideon. Who was Gideon? Gideon was a nobody. He was the least from his clan. If you think of a deliverer, nobody would think of Gideon. He's the least expected, and God works with Gideon. You think of Jephthah, he's the next judge. Who was Jephthah? He was a gunda. He was a gangster. He was a criminal. And God works with him. You think of Samson. Who was Samson? We're going to study, but he was like a womanizer. As each unexpected leader is someone like Ehud. And every time God sends a person to deliver Israel, God sends somebody who is an unlikely, unassumed, unexpected person to deliver Israel for a period, for a season, in this case, 50 years. And I'd like to ask this question, according to you and me, why does God work with people who are unassuming? You know, put the answer there. Why does God work with unlikely people, unexpected people, weak people? Why does God work with fragile people? Why does God work with people who everybody considers as outsiders, not worth it? Why does God work with kacha limbus? The reason I think this question is so important is because whatever answer you have to this question in your mind, whatever answer, whatever response you have to this question in your mind, it actually shapes your understanding of who God is. Whatever you answer, why does God work with people who are weak, fragile, unassuming, and least expect? Whatever answer you have shapes how you understand the person of God. And I'd like to give two reasons. I'm sure there are many more, but I'd like to share two reasons for today. Why does God choose to work with people who are unassuming? The first reason is great. It shows that God is a God of grace, not a God of works. What does this mean? God takes and uses, and this is not just about Ehud, it's consistent throughout the Old Testament. It's consistent throughout the New Testament. It's consistent in world history probably. God takes and uses people who are at the margins of society in order to show that salvation is from Him, not from human ability. In the New Testament, Paul speaks of this as well. Paul tends to say that God chooses and uses people who are weaker, not just socially, physically, but even morally, just so that no human being can boast in the presence of God. And the classic text of this principle is, I've not put it over there, but 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 26 and 27. Now, this is Paul speaking to the church in Corinth, and I'm going to paraphrase it. Just imagine if Paul were here and Paul would speak in this. I'm going to paraphrase it. 1 Corinthians 1, chapter 1, verses 26. He says, brothers and sisters, think of what you were when you were called. He's asking the church in Corinth to think, not to do. Think of who you were. Think of what you were when you were called. Most of you were not even wise. Most of you were not even influential. Most of you were not even of noble birth. Most of you didn't know people in the palaces, or most of you don't even know politicians. Most of you didn't even have money. And he's asking them to think of what you were when God called. It's just so that human beings will not boast in the presence of God. God chooses to work with weak, fragile, modest, unexpected, unassuming people who are on the margins of society, who are weak socially, who are weak physically, weak morally. God chooses to work just so that we know God is a God of grace, not a God of works. The second reason I want to say, why does God choose to work? And this second reason that I'm going to put over here is probably what impacted me most in preparing this sermon. And I'm going to unwrap it slowly. The second reason why God chooses to work with unassuming people is because this shatters. When God works with weak people, when God works with unassuming people, it shatters an idolatry mindset. Okay, we've been seeing of how ideals have never had sovereignty over every area of life. In other words, idol worshippers would stay in full control of their lives. There was a time when idols were only on the wall. Today we see that idols are even in our hearts. Okay, things like luxury, comfort, wealth, careers, relationship, all of this can become, all of these good things can become more important than God for us. Okay, idol worshippers, worshippers of God's substitute, worshippers of pseudo gods, are actually in full control of their lives. They only negotiate with their idol. They give their false god, they give their pseudo god whatever they want just so that they can get whatever they want. This relation is not submission. This is not surrender. This is not loving. So this is manipulation. It is cynical manipulation. If you think that if I give X to my false god, if I give X to my career, if I give X to my wealth, if I give X to my children, if I give X to my relationships, I will get Y from them. You're not submitting to it. You're manipulating them. And what was a problem over here is Israel began to turn to God, began to relate to God, not through surrender, but through negotiations. The way that they would deal with other gods, other false gods, other god substitutes. And Israel consistently worshiped the Lord as they worship the Lord as an idol. And this is not just Israel's problem. It affects you and me even today. Christians, it affects us today. And therefore, I think this is so important that God, in his unpredictable salvation, unpredictable, to get Ehud there, a left-handed man, he destroys this illusion. So remember, Ehud comes at a time when the people corporately came together and asked God for help. And this is what God was doing in response to the call. It was an unlikely answer. It was an unexpected answer. Up till now, the Israelites, they knew the living God, but they were flirting with substitutes. Up till now, they probably thought that they had tied God up, put God in their pockets, they had God in a box. They thought they had trained God well. That's always the essence of idolatry. God, and over here, God is teaching his rebellious people that their total dependence would need to come in a way that they can't imagine. Okay? I want to move to the next part. So I said in the beginning, we're gonna see of how historically God worked with weak people. Currently, we're going to see how God works with us. But redemptively, how does all of this point light to Christ? Ultimately, God sends Jesus. The story of Judges. I don't know if you remember, but last week I showed the chart, the creation, fall, redemption chart. I don't know if you remember. The story of Judges is happening in a post-fall, but pre-redemptive period. Today, where you and I stand are in a post-redemptive period. Okay, and we see ultimately redemption comes through Jesus Christ. What did God do for the salvation of the world? Whatever God did with Ehud by sending Ehud gave deliverance to Israel for 80 years. But what did God do for the salvation of the entire world to secure eternity, not just 80 years? God sends Jesus. So in the case of Ehud, who would have predicted that when this judge came himself, who would have predicted that a judge would be a left-handed person? But in the same way, who would have predicted that Jesus, the ultimate judge who came in human form, would also come in an unexpected way? Isaiah the prophet speaks of Jesus, when he speaks of Jesus in Isaiah 53. This is the description Isaiah the prophet is giving of the ultimate judge, Jesus Christ. He's saying, he had no beauty, he had no majesty, nothing to attract us to his appearance, nothing that we should desire him. He says, Jesus, he was a man who was despised, he was rejected, he was a man of sorrows, he was a man familiar with pain, an unexpected, an unlikely, and unassuming answer to prayer for the salvation of mankind in Jesus Christ. But this is the kind of Savior, as I've written over here, this is the kind of Savior that would come many centuries after Ehud to deliver and to liberate mankind in a way that no other judge could. All of the judges, including Ehud, but even after Ehud, actually point to Christ, because they are all people who are outsiders. They are people the world despises. Christ is the most unexpected deliverer of all. As we begin to prepare our hearts for Easter in a few weeks, I think we need to be constantly seeing how God is showing us, not just the Israelites in the Bible, but even us today, how God shows us that shows the world that his salvation does not come through charm, through charisma, or through enticement. To the readers of the Judges in a pre-redemptive world, they needed to see that the ultimate salvation will not come through force, through military power, through political success. It will not come in that way at all. It comes from an unassuming, rejected, undesirable baby born in a manger. It came through weakness. It came through defeat. It came through folly. Ultimately, it came through death. That's why you and I have read. So like I explained last time, we are reading Judges. We are reading a pre-redemptive event from a post-redemptive place. Therefore, when you and I today open our Bibles and open the book of Judges, we cannot truly appreciate the message. We cannot truly understand the message in its fullness unless we appreciate the work of redemption. unless we appreciate the work of Christ redeeming us on the cross. Our salvation comes through Jesus. As I begin to wrap up today, in conclusion, to ask us, what does all of this mean for me today? How does, just knowing all this historic information, what does it mean for me? What are we to do? What are we to apply? Think of Ehud. One task that God had for him was to deliver Israel, which ultimately led to 80 years of freedom from bondage. Now, this, my friends, is the only mention of Ehud in the Bible. This was his only task. You and I have a similar task. How do we know that? I'm not talking about taking a spear into a fat man. Peter writes in the New Testament, in 1 Peter, he is writing this letter. He is speaking to scattered exiles, those who were chosen according to God's foreknowledge, those who are obedient to Jesus. He's writing this letter to them. And he's saying, if you have your Bibles, and where this text is, it is preserved today till the 21st century, it's a message for you as well. He says in 1 Peter verses 9 and 10, but you are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's special possession, that you may declare the praises of him who called you out of darkness into wonderful light. He goes on to say, once you were not a people, but now you are a people. Once you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy. Peter mentions a couple of things: identity and purpose. The identity that he's reminding the readers is they were chosen. We are chosen, royal, holy, and God's special possession. He's reminding them of their identity. But he's also reminding them of purpose. You're called to declare the praises of one who's called you out of darkness into light. Now, how do we know that this verse, in its context, is deeply missional in nature? The reason we know that this passage is so deeply missional in nature, it's because the verses that follow, which you can read at a later time, the verses that follow is encouraging the readers how to live godly lives in a pagan society, how to live godly lives in a pluralistic society. Friends, all our efforts in our life purpose shadows and gives glimpses of the ultimate Savior King. My closing lines for this morning. If the gospel is true, it will impact how we view our identity. It will impact how we execute our purpose. Friends, we only have one life. I want to encourage you, be gospel bound. There is no other way to live. Let me close in prayer. I'd like to give you half a minute to just process all that you heard. Just think of certain things that touched your heart, caught your imagination, convicted you in your spirit. I shared earlier this morning that we can be in agreement